When the Third Reich crumbled in May 1945, the world watched as Nazi leaders faced justice at Nuremberg or met their end in bunkers beneath Berlin. But what happened to those who shared their bloodline? The brothers, sisters, and relatives who carried the same family names that would forever be associated with humanity's darkest chapter. While history books chronicle the fates of Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels, the stories of their siblings reveal a different kind of aftermath. Some would spend decades in hiding, changing their identities and fleeing across continents. Others would be haunted by family secrets they never knew existed, and a few would find themselves caught between loyalty to blood relatives and the horrifying truth of what those relatives had done. These are the untold stories of the Nazi leaders' siblings, and what you're about to discover will change how you think about guilt, family, and the lingering shadows of history. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and mastermind behind the concentration camp system, had two brothers who would face vastly different fates after 1945. Heinrich had two brothers, Gebhard Ludwig and Ernst Hermann. While Heinrich orchestrated genocide, his brothers lived in a complex web of family loyalty and political reality that would define their post-war existence in dramatically different ways. The Himmler family had been middle-class Catholics from Bavaria, with their father working as a school principal and their mother maintaining traditional household values. Heinrich's transformation from a quiet, studious child into the Reich's most feared administrator shocked even his own family members. His brothers had watched his political evolution with growing unease, but family loyalty and the dangerous political climate made open opposition nearly impossible. Gebhard Himmler, the eldest of the three brothers, worked as a mechanical engineer throughout the war years. Unlike his infamous brother, Gebhard maintained a relatively low profile during the Nazi period. He was aware of Heinrich's position, but claimed to have limited knowledge of the SS operations. After Germany's defeat, Gebhard faced intense scrutiny from Allied investigators who couldn't believe that Heinrich Himmler's own brother knew nothing of the final solution. The interrogations were relentless and lasted for months. Allied officials brought Gebhard photographs from concentration camps, documents bearing Heinrich's signature, and testimonies from survivors. They wanted to know what the family knew, when they knew it, and how much they had supported their brother's rise to power. Gebhard maintained his innocence, claiming that family dinners never included discussions of mass murder and that Heinrich kept his SS activities separate from family relationships. Gebhard's own wartime experiences had been relatively mundane compared to his brother's activities. He had worked in engineering projects that supported the war effort, but claimed no knowledge of the specific uses to which his technical expertise was being put. His interrogators found this difficult to believe, suspecting that someone in Heinrich's inner circle of trust must have shared information about SS operations with family members. The psychological pressure on Gebhard was enormous. He was held in Allied detention facilities for over a year, while investigators tried to determine his level of complicity. During this time, he was repeatedly shown evidence of his brother's crimes and asked to explain how he could have remained ignorant of such massive operations. Gebhard's responses revealed a man who had chosen willful ignorance as a survival strategy, focusing on his technical work while avoiding questions about the broader context of Nazi policies. But the real tragedy of the Himmler family lay with the youngest brother, Ernst Hermann. Unlike Gebhard, Ernst had been swept up in the Nazi ideology during his youth. He joined the party and served in various administrative roles. As the war turned against Germany, Ernst found himself stationed in Bavaria, witnessing the collapse of everything he had believed in. Ernst Hermann's involvement in the Nazi system had been more direct than Gebhard's. He had worked in party administration and had been responsible for implementing various Nazi policies at the local level. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, Ernst began to understand the full scope of what his brother had accomplished and his own role in supporting the system that had made it possible. The final months of the war were particularly difficult for Ernst Hermann. He received reports about the liberation of concentration camps and began to comprehend the magnitude of the crimes that had been committed. Unlike Gebhard, who could claim ignorance, Ernst had been involved in the administrative machinery that had enabled Heinrich's operations. He had processed paperwork, coordinated logistics, and supported policies that he was now beginning to understand had facilitated genocide. In the final weeks of the war, as American forces advanced through southern Germany, Ernst Hermann Himmler made a decision that would seal his fate. Rather than face capture and the inevitable questions about his family connections, he chose to end his own life in 1945. The weight of carrying the Himmler name, combined with his own involvement in the Nazi system, became unbearable. Gebhard, however, survived the post-war period and lived until 1982. He spent the remainder of his life in relative obscurity, working as an engineer and rarely speaking publicly about his brother. When asked by historians about Heinrich, Gebhard would often deflect, saying he remembered his brother as a chicken farmer and ambitious bureaucrat, not the monster history would remember. The challenges Gebhard faced in rebuilding his life were immense. Even after being cleared by denazification proceedings, he struggled to find employment because of his surname. Potential employers were reluctant to hire anyone connected to Heinrich Himmler, regardless of their personal involvement in Nazi crimes. Gebhard was forced to move several times to find communities where his identity was less well known. The Himmler case illustrates a pattern that would emerge across many Nazi families. The surviving siblings were left to grapple with names that had become synonymous with evil, while struggling to rebuild their own identities in post-war Germany. But the Himmler brothers' story was just the beginning. The complexity of family relationships during the Nazi era would prove even more twisted in other prominent Nazi households. Hermann Goering, the flamboyant head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest confidants, came from a family that would produce one of the war's most unexpected heroes. Göring's elder siblings were Karl, Olga, and Paula. His younger brother was Albert. While Hermann was orchestrating the Nazi war machine from his luxurious headquarters, his younger brother Albert was quietly working to undermine everything the Nazi regime represented. The contrast between Hermann and Albert Goering was evident from their early years. While Hermann was drawn to military pageantry and political power, Albert showed more interest in business and individual relationships. Their father, Heinrich Ernst Goering, had been a colonial administrator, and their mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, came from a middle-class Bavarian family. The family dynamics were complex, with Hermann's early success in World War I creating expectations for achievement that would affect all the siblings. Albert Goering was perhaps the most remarkable sibling of any Nazi leader. Working in various business roles throughout the war, Albert used his family name and connections to save hundreds of lives. He would forge documents, arrange safe passage for Jewish families, and even personally intervene to prevent arrests. The irony was staggering. While Hermann Goering was implementing policies that led to millions of deaths, Albert was using the Goering name to rescue people from those very same policies. Albert's resistance activities were not small-scale gestures. He organized escape routes through Czechoslovakia, provided false identity papers, and used his brother's influence to release people from concentration camps. He would call SS headquarters, identify himself as Albert Goering, and demand the release of specific prisoners. The SS officers, assuming he was acting on behalf of his powerful brother, would comply without question. The scope of Albert's operations was remarkable. He established networks of contacts throughout occupied Europe, who would help him identify people in danger and coordinate rescue efforts. He used his position as a businessman to travel freely between countries, often carrying forged documents or messages for resistance groups. His activities included helping Czech resistance members escape capture, arranging safe passage for Jewish families fleeing Germany, and even sabotaging Nazi industrial projects when possible. One of Albert's most audacious operations involved using his brother's personal stationery to write letters of protection for Jewish families. He would forge Hermann's signature on documents declaring that certain individuals were under the personal protection of the Reichsmarschall. These documents proved remarkably effective at preventing arrests and deportations, as local Nazi officials were reluctant to interfere with anyone who appeared to have Hermann Göring's personal backing. Albert also used his business connections to funnel money and resources to resistance groups. He would arrange legitimate business transactions that included hidden payments to anti-Nazi organizations or individuals working to save lives. His understanding of international business practices and his ability to travel made him an effective coordinator for various rescue operations. The relationship between the two brothers was strained, but never completely severed. Hermann was aware of some of Albert's activities but chose not to intervene directly. Some historians believe Hermann saw Albert's actions as a form of insurance. If Germany lost the war, Having a brother with a record of helping victims might prove useful. Others suggest that Hermann genuinely loved his brother despite their political differences. Family gatherings during the war years were reportedly tense affairs. Albert would challenge Hermann's policies directly, leading to heated arguments about Nazi ideology and the direction of the war. However, Hermann never used his official position to stop Albert's activities, perhaps because he understood that family loyalty worked both ways. Albert's protection of others was matched by Hermann's protection of Albert. When the war ended, Albert's situation became precarious. He was arrested by American forces who initially treated him as just another member of the Goring family. The interrogators couldn't understand how Hermann Göring's brother could have been working against the Nazi regime. It took months of investigation and testimony from people Albert had saved before the Allies accepted his story. The process of proving Albert's innocence was complicated by the fact that many of the people he had saved were scattered across Europe or had been killed despite his efforts. Tracking down witnesses who could testify to his resistance activities required extensive investigation by Allied authorities. Some of the evidence had been destroyed during the war, while other documentation was in the hands of survivors who were themselves struggling to rebuild their lives. But being a Goering who had opposed the Nazis didn't guarantee Albert an easy post-war life. He struggled to find employment, as potential employers were suspicious of anyone with the Guring name. People who had been saved by Albert's efforts came forward to testify on his behalf, but the stigma remained. He spent years battling to clear his name completely, providing extensive documentation of his resistance activities. Albert lived in relative poverty for much of the post-war period, never fully escaping the shadow of his brother's crimes. He died in 1966, having spent 2 decades trying to rebuild a life while carrying one of the most infamous surnames in history. His story demonstrates how family names could become both a burden and, in Albert's case, a tool for resistance. The contrast between the Goering brothers shows how individuals within the same family could make radically different moral choices. While Hermann basked in Nazi power and luxury, Albert risked his life daily to save others. Yet both would be forever linked by blood and name. As complex as the Goering family dynamics were, they pale in comparison to the psychological warfare that would unfold within the Goebbels household. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master of propaganda, came from a large Catholic family that would be forever changed by his rise to power. Goebbels had 5 siblings: Konrad, Hans, Maria, Elizabeth, and Maria, who married the German filmmaker Max Kimmich. The surviving siblings would face unique challenges as they tried to distance themselves from Joseph's legacy while dealing with their own wartime experiences. The Goebbels family had deep roots in the Rhineland, with their father working as a factory foreman and their mother maintaining a devoutly Catholic household. Joseph's transformation from a struggling intellectual into the Nazi Party's chief propagandist created enormous tension within the family structure. His siblings watched with growing alarm as his rhetoric became increasingly extreme, and his influence over German public opinion expanded. Konrad Goebbels, the eldest sibling, worked as a school teacher and maintained a complicated relationship with his famous brother throughout the Nazi period. As Joseph rose through the party ranks, becoming one of Hitler's most trusted advisors, Konrad found himself in an impossible position. He disapproved of many Nazi policies, but couldn't completely disown his brother without risking his own safety and livelihood. Konrad's position as an educator made his situation particularly difficult. As Joseph's propaganda ministry began implementing new curricula that emphasized racial ideology and German nationalism, Konrad was expected to teach materials that contradicted his personal beliefs. He tried to maintain his professional duties while minimizing his compliance with the most extreme aspects of Nazi educational policies. The relationship between Konrad and Joseph became increasingly strained as the Nazi period progressed. Family gatherings became tense affairs where political discussions were avoided by mutual agreement. Konrad later described feeling like he was walking on eggshells whenever he was around his brother, never knowing when a casual comment might trigger a political argument or worse. During the war years, Konrad tried to maintain a low profile while working in education. He avoided political rallies and Nazi Party events whenever possible, but his connection to Joseph made complete anonymity impossible. Local party officials would regularly approach him, expecting support for various initiatives because of his family connection to the propaganda minister. Konrad's wartime experiences included witnessing the gradual transformation of German education from academic learning to ideological indoctrination. He saw firsthand how Joseph's propaganda techniques were being implemented in classrooms across Germany and how children were being taught to embrace Nazi ideology. This personal observation of his brother's impact on German youth would later influence his post-war testimony about the propaganda ministry's operations. After Germany's defeat, Conrad faced immediate suspicion from occupying forces. Allied investigators assumed that anyone related to Joseph Goebbels must have been involved in Nazi propaganda efforts. Conrad underwent extensive interrogation about his brother's activities, the family's political discussions, and his own role during the Nazi period. He maintained that he had worked as a teacher and nothing more, but proving innocence when you're a Goebbels proved nearly impossible. The interrogation process was particularly intense for Conrad, because investigators believed that Joseph might have shared propaganda strategies or techniques with his family members. They questioned him repeatedly about conversations with Joseph, family dinners where politics might have been discussed, and any assistance he might have provided to the propaganda ministry. Conrad's responses painted a picture of a family where the famous member had become increasingly isolated from his relatives due to political differences. The post-war period was devastating for Conrad. He lost his teaching position, struggled to find work, and faced constant harassment from people who recognized his name. Former colleagues and neighbors who had once been friendly became distant or openly hostile. The name Goebbels had become so associated with Nazi propaganda that any family member was viewed with suspicion. Conrad's attempts to find new employment were repeatedly frustrated by his surname. School districts would not hire him. Other educational institutions rejected his applications, and even private tutoring opportunities dried up when parents learned of his family connection. He was forced to take manual labor jobs under assumed names, constantly fearful that his true identity would be discovered. Hans Goebbels faced similar challenges but died in 1947, just 2 years after the war's end. The circumstances of his death remain somewhat unclear, but family members suggested that the stress of carrying the Goebbels name, combined with health problems, contributed to his early demise. He had spent the final years of his life trying to find work and rebuild his reputation, but the task proved overwhelming. Hans had worked in various business roles during the war and had tried to maintain distance from his brother's political activities. However, like Conrad, he found that family connections made complete separation impossible. Local Nazi officials expected him to support party initiatives, while Allied investigators later suspected him of complicity in propaganda efforts. The youngest sister, Maria, who had married filmmaker Max Kimmich, faced particular scrutiny because her husband had produced propaganda films during the war. The couple found themselves blacklisted from the German film industry after 1945. Maria spent years defending both her husband's work and distancing herself from her brother's more extreme propaganda efforts. She argued that entertainment films, even those made during the Nazi period, were different from the hate-filled speeches and publications that Joseph had produced. Maria's situation was complicated by the fact that her husband's films were still in circulation and continued to generate controversy long after the war ended. Film critics and historians would analyze these movies for propaganda content, often concluding that they had been designed to support Nazi ideology. Maria found herself repeatedly forced to defend artistic choices that had been made years earlier under very different circumstances. What made the Goebbels siblings' situation particularly difficult was the nature of Joseph's crimes. While other Nazi leaders could be seen as politicians or military figures who made terrible decisions, Joseph was specifically responsible for spreading the ideology that made genocide possible. His propaganda had reached into every German home, and his siblings would forever be associated with the lies and hatred he had propagated. The surviving Goebbels siblings lived with a unique burden. They weren't just related to a war criminal, but to the man who had convinced millions of Germans to support war crimes. This made their post-war rehabilitation nearly impossible, as any attempt to defend family memories was seen as defending Nazi ideology itself. But perhaps no Nazi family would face as much international attention and scrutiny as the relatives of Adolf Hitler himself. Adolf Hitler's family relationships were complex even before he became Germany's dictator, and the aftermath of his rule would scatter his relatives across the globe in ways that few could have predicted. A couple of Adolf's relatives served in Nazi Germany during the war. Adolf's half-nephew, Heinz, was a member of the Nazi Party. The Hitler name would become so toxic that family members would spend decades trying to escape its shadow through elaborate schemes of identity transformation and geographic displacement. The Hitler family tree was already complicated by the time Adolf rose to power. His father, Alois Hitler, had been married 3 times and had children from multiple relationships. This created a network of half-siblings, step-relatives, and distant cousins who would all find themselves connected to history's most notorious name. Many of these relatives had maintained minimal contact with Adolf during his rise to power, but their shared surname would make anonymity impossible after 1945. Hitler's half-brother Alois Hitler Jr. had emigrated to Ireland before World War I, where he married Bridget Dowling and had a son, William Patrick Hitler. This branch of the Hitler family would become one of the most unusual stories of the entire Nazi period. William Patrick Hitler actually lived in Nazi Germany for several years during the 1930s, trying to capitalize on his family connection to gain employment and social status. William Patrick's experiences in Nazi Germany were both fascinating and disturbing. He initially saw his uncle's rise to power as an opportunity for personal advancement. He moved to Germany in 1933 and attempted to use his family connection to secure a position within the Nazi hierarchy. Adolf Hitler was initially helpful, arranging for William Patrick to work in various capacities, including at a bank and later in an automobile factory. However, the relationship between uncle and nephew quickly became strained. William Patrick began making increasingly bold demands for better treatment and more prominent positions within the Nazi system. He threatened to reveal embarrassing family secrets if his requests were not met, including details about Adolf's ancestry and personal relationships that could have damaged the Führer's carefully constructed public image. William Patrick worked briefly for his uncle Adolf, helping with some business matters and attending Nazi party events. However, the relationship soured when William Patrick began making demands for better treatment and more prominent positions within the Nazi hierarchy. Adolf Hitler grew tired of his nephew's requests and eventually told him to renounce his British citizenship if he wanted to advance in Nazi Germany. The final confrontation between Adolf and William Patrick reportedly occurred in 1938, when William Patrick demanded either a high-ranking position in the Nazi government or significant financial compensation for keeping quiet about family matters. Adolf Hitler, furious at what he saw as blackmail attempts, told his nephew to leave Germany immediately and never return. Instead of complying with his uncle's demands to renounce his British citizenship, William Patrick returned to Britain and later traveled to the United States, where he began giving lectures about his famous uncle. He provided insights into Hitler's personality and private behavior that proved valuable to Allied intelligence services. His lectures drew large crowds of people curious to hear first-hand accounts of Hitler's private life and family relationships. William Patrick's transition from would-be Nazi insider to Allied intelligence asset was remarkable. He provided detailed information about Hitler's personal habits, psychological makeup, and family relationships that helped intelligence analysts understand the German leader's motivations and potential weaknesses. His insights were particularly valuable because they came from personal observation rather than second-hand reports. During the war, William Patrick actually joined the U.S. Navy and served against the country his uncle was leading. This decision to take up arms against Nazi Germany demonstrated his complete break with his family's most famous member. However, his service in the American military also created unique challenges, as his fellow sailors often questioned his loyalty and motivations. After the war ended, William Patrick Hitler faced a dilemma that would define the rest of his life. The Hitler name was now associated with genocide and World War, making it nearly impossible to live normally. He changed his surname and moved to Long Island, where he started a new life under a different identity. He married, had children, and spent the rest of his life trying to ensure that his family's connection to Adolf Hitler remained secret. The lengths to which William Patrick went to hide his identity were extraordinary. He rarely spoke about his past, avoided any activities that might draw public attention, and warned his children about the importance of maintaining their anonymity. He lived in constant fear that someone would discover who he really was, and that his family would face harassment or worse. William Patrick's new identity required careful construction of an alternative personal history. He created believable explanations for his accent, his lack of American childhood memories, and his unfamiliarity with certain aspects of American culture. He avoided situations where he might encounter people who had known him before the war, and carefully managed his social interactions to prevent accidental revelations. The psychological strain of maintaining a false identity for decades was enormous. William Patrick could never speak honestly about his childhood, his experiences in Nazi Germany, or his wartime service without risking exposure. He had to constantly monitor his conversations to ensure that he didn't accidentally reveal information that would contradict his constructed identity. William Patrick's children grew up knowing they were related to Adolf Hitler, but were instructed never to discuss this fact with anyone outside the immediate family. They attended school, made friends, and built lives without anyone knowing their true family history. The psychological impact of carrying such a secret while trying to live normal American lives created unique challenges for the next generation of the Hitler family. The children faced particular difficulties during their adolescent years when they began to understand the full implications of their family heritage. They struggled with questions about their identity, their place in American society, and their responsibility for their grandfather's crimes. Some sought counseling to help process these complex feelings, while others chose to completely suppress any discussion of their family background. Other Hitler relatives faced similar decisions about identity and secrecy. Some changed their names and moved to different countries, while others tried to maintain low profiles while keeping their original identities. The scattered nature of the Hitler family meant that different branches faced different challenges, but all struggled with the weight of their surname. Adolf's sister Paula Hitler, who had remained in Austria throughout the war, faced intense scrutiny from Allied investigators after 1945. She was repeatedly questioned about her knowledge of her brother's activities and her own role in supporting the Nazi regime. Paula maintained that she had lived quietly as a secretary and had minimal contact with Adolf during his years in power. Paula's post-war life was marked by poverty and isolation. She struggled to find employment, faced constant harassment from people who recognized her name, and lived in fear of reprisals from Holocaust survivors or their families. She eventually changed her name and moved to a small town where she hoped to live anonymously, but her identity was eventually discovered by journalists in the 1950s. The Hitler family's story shows how the crimes of one individual could affect multiple generations and force entire family lines to essentially disappear from public view. Unlike other Nazi families who might eventually rehabilitate their reputations, the Hitler name remained so toxic that complete anonymity became the only viable option for survival. Others tried to maintain low profiles while keeping their original identities. The scattered nature of the Hitler family meant that different branches faced different challenges, but all struggled with the weight of their surname. As we've seen with the Himmler, Guring, Goebbels, and Hitler families, the siblings and relatives of Nazi leaders faced extraordinary challenges after 1945, but their stories also reveal something deeper about how societies deal with collective guilt and family responsibility. The children and grandchildren of Nazi leaders' siblings would grow up in a world where their family names carried the weight of history's greatest crimes. These second and third generation family members faced unique psychological challenges as they tried to build identities separate from their ancestors' actions while dealing with the ongoing stigma of their surnames. Many of these individuals spent their childhoods completely unaware of their family connections to the Nazi regime. Parents who had survived the immediate post-war period often chose to shield their children from the truth, hoping to give them normal upbringings free from the burden of family history. However, this approach often backfired when the children eventually discovered their true heritage as adults. The decision of when and how to reveal family history became a source of enormous anxiety for many parents. Some chose to tell their children when they reached adolescence, believing that teenagers could better understand the complexities of the situation. Others waited until their children were adults with families of their own, hoping that maturity would help them process the information more effectively. The methods of revelation varied widely among families. Some parents presented the information as historical fact, emphasizing that the children bore no responsibility for their ancestors' actions. Others approached the topic more emotionally, sharing their own struggles with family guilt and shame. A few families discovered their heritage accidentally through historical research or genealogical investigations, creating additional trauma through the element of surprise. The psychological impact of learning that your grandfather or great-uncle was responsible for mass murder cannot be overstated. Many descendants of Nazi families have described experiencing identity crises, depression, and a profound sense of shame that they had done nothing to earn. Some sought therapy to help process the information, while others became activists working to prevent future genocides as a way of atoning for family crimes. The therapeutic community gradually developed specialized approaches for helping descendants of perpetrators deal with their family histories. These counseling methods focused on separating personal identity from ancestral actions, while acknowledging the legitimate emotional impact of carrying such family legacies. Support groups were established, where individuals with similar backgrounds could share their experiences without fear of judgment. Several documentaries and books have explored the experiences of these family members, revealing the ongoing struggle to separate personal identity from family history. Some chose to embrace their heritage as a form of historical responsibility, becoming educators about the dangers of extremism. Others rejected any connection to their family's past and worked to ensure that future generations would never be associated with Nazi crimes. The impact extended beyond just personal relationships. Many found that career opportunities were limited when their family connections became known. Some faced harassment or threats from people who believed that Nazi ideology was hereditary, or that family members should bear responsibility for their relatives' crimes. Others discovered that their family names opened doors with neo-Nazi groups, or Holocaust deniers, who hoped to gain legitimacy through association with historical figures. Professional consequences varied depending on the individual's chosen career path. Those who entered public service, education, or media faced particular scrutiny, as their family backgrounds could become public knowledge and potentially undermine their effectiveness. Some chose careers in fields where their identities could remain private, while others deliberately entered professions where they could work to counter extremist ideologies. Dating and marriage presented particular challenges for many descendants of Nazi families. Revealing family history to potential partners required enormous trust and often led to relationship difficulties. Some chose to only date people from similar backgrounds who would understand the complexities of their situation, while others decided to marry individuals from families that had been victimized by the Nazi regime as a form of historical reconciliation. The timing of such revelations in romantic relationships became a source of significant anxiety. Revealing family history too early might end promising relationships before they could develop, while waiting too long could be seen as deceptive. Many individuals developed careful strategies for gradually introducing their family backgrounds to romantic partners, testing their reactions and commitment levels. The question of whether to have children became particularly fraught for many family members. Some worried about passing on the psychological burden to another generation, while others feared that their family names would continue to cause problems for future descendants. A few chose not to have children specifically to end their family lines, while others had children but worked to ensure they would grow up with strong moral foundations that would prevent any repetition of family history. Educational challenges also affected many descendants of Nazi families. Parents struggled with how to help their children understand their family history, while protecting them from potential harassment at school. Some families moved frequently to avoid discovery, while others chose to homeschool their children to maintain greater control over their social environments. The rise of the internet created new challenges for families trying to maintain their privacy. Online databases, social media platforms, and genealogical websites made it easier for people to discover family connections that had been hidden for decades. Some families found themselves unexpectedly exposed when distant relatives shared family information online, without considering the consequences. Social media presented particular challenges for younger generation family members who had grown up with technology as a normal part of life. They had to be constantly careful about what information they shared online, who they connected with, and how their digital footprints might reveal their family backgrounds. Some chose to maintain minimal online presence, while others used false names or carefully constructed alternative identities. The Allied denazification process created specific challenges for the families of Nazi leaders. Unlike ordinary German citizens who might face questionnaires about their wartime activities, the relatives of prominent Nazis were subjected to intensive investigations that could last for years. These proceedings would determine not only individual culpability, but also the extent to which entire family networks had been complicit in Nazi crimes. The denazification courts faced unprecedented challenges when dealing with family members of Nazi leaders. Standard questionnaires and interviews were insufficient for determining the complex relationships between blood relatives and political affiliates. Investigators had to untangle decades of family history, personal relationships, and political evolution to understand how individual family members had responded to their relatives' rise to power. The legal framework for denazification was designed primarily for direct participants in Nazi organizations, not for family members who might have been indirectly involved or benefited from their relatives' positions. This created significant gaps in the process, as traditional categories of perpetrator bystander, and victim, didn't adequately describe the complex situations faced by Nazi leaders' siblings. The denazification courts had to determine not just individual culpability, but also the extent to which family members had benefited from Nazi connections or supported the regime. This process was complicated by the fact that many siblings had maintained complex relationships with their famous relatives, disapproving of their politics while still maintaining family ties. Family loyalty versus political opposition became a central theme in many denazification proceedings. Investigators struggled to understand how individuals could simultaneously love their family members while opposing their political actions. The concept of compartmentalized relationships, where family affection existed separately from political disagreement, was difficult for many Allied officials to comprehend. The burden of proof in these cases often fell on the family members themselves, who had to demonstrate their innocence rather than having prosecutors prove their guilt. This reversed burden of proof created enormous stress for individuals who had to document their wartime activities and provide evidence of their opposition to Nazi policies. Many struggled to find witnesses who could testify to their anti-Nazi sentiments, particularly when such testimony might have been dangerous to express during the war years. Some family members found themselves in the peculiar position of providing testimony against their own relatives in order to clear themselves of suspicion. Brothers would testify that they had disagreed with their siblings' political choices, while sisters would provide evidence of their own opposition to Nazi policies. These testimonies created permanent rifts in families that often never healed. The emotional toll of testifying against family members was enormous. Many individuals described feeling like they were betraying their relatives, even when those relatives had committed terrible crimes. The conflict between family loyalty and moral responsibility created psychological trauma that lasted for decades. Some family members refused to testify against their relatives, accepting potential consequences, rather than providing evidence that might be used against their own blood relations. Property and financial assets presented another major challenge during denazification proceedings. Many Nazi leaders had used their positions to accumulate wealth, and determining which family members had benefited from these ill-gotten gains proved complex. Some siblings had received gifts or financial support that they claimed to have been unaware came from criminal activities. Others had inherited property that had been confiscated from Jewish families or other victims of the regime. The process of tracing Nazi wealth and determining legitimate versus illegitimate assets required extensive investigation. Allied authorities had to examine bank records, property transfers, and business transactions dating back to the 1930s. Many documents had been destroyed during the war, making it difficult to establish clear chains of ownership or financial responsibility. Some family members found themselves in possession of valuable items that had been stolen from Holocaust victims or other persecuted groups. Art collections, jewelry, and other valuables that had been acquired by Nazi leaders often ended up in the hands of their relatives, who might have been unaware of their criminal origins. The denazification process required these family members to surrender such items, often leaving them in difficult financial positions. The denazification process also revealed the extent to which ordinary family members had been complicit in Nazi crimes, even when they weren't directly involved in policymaking. Some had provided false alibis for their relatives, while others had helped hide evidence or assisted in escapes during the final weeks of the war. These discoveries often surprised both the families themselves and the investigators. The revelation of previously unknown family involvement in Nazi crimes created additional trauma for many individuals who had believed their relatives to be innocent. Learning that a trusted family member had helped cover up atrocities or had been more involved in Nazi activities than previously known shattered many people's understanding of their own family histories. For those family members who were cleared of wrongdoing, the denazification process provided official documentation that they could use to rebuild their lives. However, for many Germans, official clearance meant little when the family name alone was enough to generate suspicion and hostility. The psychological impact of being investigated, questioned, and judged by occupation forces left lasting scars on many individuals. The denazification process also created a permanent historical record of family relationships and political affiliations that would follow these individuals for the rest of their lives. Even those who were cleared of wrongdoing found that their denazification files could be accessed by potential employers, investigators, or journalists. making true anonymity nearly impossible. The classification system used in denazification proceedings created additional complications for family members. Categories ranging from major offenders to followers didn't adequately capture the nuanced positions of many family members who had neither actively supported nor completely opposed the Nazi regime. Many found themselves classified in ways that didn't accurately reflect their actual wartime experiences or beliefs. After 1945, many relatives of Nazi leaders chose to erase their identities, often creating entirely new lives. This involved more than changing names. It meant severing ties, fabricating histories, and sometimes relocating across continents. The process required careful planning, resources, and often help from friends, churches, or even Allied authorities, especially for those who had opposed the Nazi regime or aided in intelligence efforts. Some were aided by underground networks, including religious groups or resistance members, who valued individual actions over family guilt. South America was a common destination due to its large German communities and lenient political climates. Creating new identities involved forging documents, mastering false life stories, and destroying personal mementos. The emotional toll was immense, with many feeling they had lost themselves entirely. The strain of living under false pretenses led some to mental health struggles. As historical interest in the Nazi era grew, many who had disappeared were rediscovered through journalism, research, or modern tools like DNA tests and genealogy databases. This often exposed hidden family ties and forced descendants to confront painful truths about their identities and histories. Some relatives of Nazi leaders chose to break family silence, speaking out against extremism and sharing personal insights into how ordinary people can be drawn into evil. These decisions often came with personal costs, public scrutiny, emotional strain, and criticism from all sides. Motivated by guilt, moral duty, or a desire to prevent future atrocities, some spoke publicly, participated in documentaries, and worked with Holocaust education groups. Their testimonies humanized history, helping students and audiences understand the real human cost of radical ideologies. Many faced harsh judgment, accusations of profiteering, misrepresentation, or betrayal. Some were even threatened by neo-Nazis or questioned by survivors. Despite this, they saw silence as complicity and felt a responsibility to educate. Some engaged in dialogue with survivors' families, partaking in structured programs aimed at reconciliation. Though emotionally taxing, these encounters sometimes led to deep mutual understanding and lasting relationships. Media attention added pressure, often distorting their messages. Still, these individuals persisted, believing their unique perspectives could help society recognize the warning signs of extremism. Many also became advocates for modern social justice, drawing parallels between past and present to promote awareness and resistance to authoritarianism. Descendants of Nazi leaders' siblings still wrestle with their family legacies. Some have found success while managing public ties to their past. Others remain anonymous. Social media and genetic testing have made it harder to stay hidden, exposing long-concealed connections and sometimes leading to harassment. While some descendants engage in anti-extremism or public service, others quietly seek to contribute positively under the weight of their lineage. The idea of inherited guilt continues to evolve, yet those with infamous surnames often still face stigma. These families also struggle with how and when to share their history with future generations. Some choose openness, others secrecy. Their stories highlight how historical trauma affects both victims and the families of perpetrators, offering insight into the enduring impact of extremism and the complexities of reconciliation. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.